The medieval peasant diet was a thrilling game of will this kill me or just make me wish it had. These poor souls worked from sunrise to sunset, only to feast on the culinary masterpiece that was bread. And if they were feeling fancy, more bread. Maybe some watery pottage if the local lord wasn't hoarding everything. Meat? Only if you counted the occasional rat that fell into the gruel. So, was it nutritious? Barely. Delicious? I guess you should stick till the end to find out.
Medieval peasantry was a delightful mix of back-breaking labor, involuntary charity, and the ever-present risk of dying from something as mundane as a flea bite. You see, if you were a peasant, congratulations. You were basically an unpaid intern for your local lord and the church. Farming wasn't just a job, it was an all-consuming lifestyle, dictated by the whims of nature and a nobleman who probably couldn't tell a plough from his own backside. You didn't just work your own land, no, that would be too easy. You also had to work on the lord's land, because apparently he was too busy hunting, feasting, and railing the local maidens to do it himself. And just in case that wasn't enough, the church also demanded free labor because, God needed his fields ploughed too. The only thing growing faster than crops were your obligations. And of course we can't forget the tithe, that charming little system where you had to hand over 1/10 of everything you earned to the church. Not in cash because, let's be real, peasants rarely saw a single coin. No, you paid in goods, usually seeds, because nothing screams devotion to the Lord quite like starving your family for the sake of ecclesiastical bookkeeping. The church stored these tithes in massive barns, which, in a delightful twist of irony, often became 5-star rat hotels. So while you were breaking your back in the fields, a horde of disease-carrying rodents was feasting on the literal fruits of your labor, ensuring that neither you nor God would be enjoying that grain. And if you thought you could supplement your meager diet with a little unauthorized hunting, think again. The forests belonged to the nobles, and poaching was a crime punishable by death, or if you were lucky, the removal of a few limbs. The rich got to chase deer and boars for sport, while you got to chase your chickens around your dirt floor hovel, hoping a wolf didn't beat you to it. Speaking of chickens, they were so valuable for their eggs that killing one for meat was considered reckless. Your
best bet for a decent meal was a pig, which, fun fact, was one of the only animals capable of fending off predators. Imagine a medieval peasant, malnourished and exhausted, standing helplessly as his pig fought off a fox, probably doing a better job defending property than the local lord's militia.
winter was especially fun because domesticated animals couldn't survive on their own, so you had to bring them inside. Try sleeping next to a cow that doesn't understand personal space while chickens casually deposit their business all over your straw mattress. And since sanitation wasn't exactly a priority, your home was essentially an all-inclusive spa for fleas, lice, and whatever diseases they were generous enough to share. Waste disposal was equally sophisticated. Chamber pots, if you were lucky, a communal ditch, if you weren't. And because medieval life was nothing if not a comedy of errors, that same river you dumped your waste into was also your main source of drinking and cooking water. If you've ever wondered how people survived this long, so do historians. Food was as exciting as life itself, meaning it was repetitive, bland, and mostly about survival. Meat was a luxury, unless you were one of the few fortunate souls who had a cow too old to milk or a pig fat enough to slaughter. Every part of the animal was used because throwing anything away was a foreign concept. Even the intestines were turned into sausage casings because clearly someone back then looked at pig guts and thought, ah yes, this would make an excellent food container. Pigs, however, were a dream come true for peasants. They were low maintenance, ate whatever garbage was available, much like their owners, and when slaughtered, provided enough fat and protein to keep a family alive through the winter. Black pudding, bacon and ham were cherished because, unlike the peasants themselves, they actually lasted through the cold months.
But let's talk about the real winners of medieval dining, the nobility. While peasants were gnawing on barley and praying for an extra scrap of bacon, the upper class was enjoying a menu that could best be described as culinary insanity. Swans, peacocks, hedgehogs, and even cats were on the menu. Hedgehogs were baked in pies, Swans were roasted and then redressed in their own feathers like some nightmarish taxidermy project, and peacocks, because simply eating them wasn't pretentious enough, were sometimes served with fireworks attached to their tails. The rich didn't just eat better, they ate like lunatics. Rabbits, on the other hand, were everybody's go-to snack. Nobles kept them in large pens called warrens, while peasants had to rely on snares and sheer luck. And then there were lampreys, hideous, parasitic, eel-like creatures that were somehow considered a delicacy. King Henry Brunwald of England allegedly ate so many that he literally died of a lamprey overdose. That's right. The ruler of one of the most powerful nations in medieval Europe was taken down by a fish that looks freaky. Religion, of course, had its sticky fingers in medieval eating habits. Fasting wasn't just a trendy diet choice, it was mandatory. By the 10th century, Christians were expected to fast 3 days a week, abstaining from food until the afternoon, and avoiding meat entirely on certain days. The nobility, naturally, found loopholes because wealth and morality rarely went hand in hand. Fish was allowed on fasting days, which led to some creative interpretations like classifying beavers as fish. Yup, you read that correctly. Some monks genuinely argued that beavers were fish because of their tails, allowing them to chow down on roasted beaver while still technically obeying church law. Medieval loophole, I guess. Meanwhile, salted and pickled fish were a staple, and much like medieval life in general, they were an exercise in endurance rather than enjoyment. Mackerel, herring, and eels made up a significant portion of the diet, and because refrigeration wasn't a thing, preservation methods were primitive at best. Salted cod, or stockfish, was so tough that it had to be beaten with a mallet before it could be cooked. Imagine sitting down for dinner and having to beat your meat before even taking a bite. I meant cold. Anyways, let's come back to Lent. Now, nothing shows devotion like 40 days of voluntary starvation while everyone else goes about their business, eating their weight in roasted meats. This delightful exercise in suffering leads up to Easter, the one time of year when it's socially acceptable to eat chocolate eggs laid by an imaginary rabbit. It officially kicks off on Ash Wednesday, when a priest rubs some soot on your forehead and reminds you that you're basically biodegradable. Historically, Lent lasted 46 days because Sundays didn't count, apparently proving that even medieval monks had loopholes. Of course, because humans can't resist making things even more miserable, Lent used to be brutal: no meat, no dairy, no eggs, and only one meal a day, if that. For medieval peasants, this was less of a religious challenge and more of an extended death march. Imagine working 14-hour days on a farm, only to come home to a bowl of lukewarm salted fish and the overwhelming urge to punch God. Ash Wednesday and Good Friday were particularly festive, meaning no food at all. Because nothing prepares you for spiritual enlightenment like the sensation of your stomach eating itself. The church did, however, offer exemptions. If you were a child, elderly, a beggar, or a pilgrim, congratulations, you could keep eating, because clearly walking long distances to visit a holy site required more sustenance than, say, breaking your back in a field. Makes sense. Now, no matter your social status, bread was the one thing you could rely on to remind you of where you stood in life. Poor? Enjoy your coarse, brown, rock-hard loaf, which was about as edible as the dirt it came from. Rich? You got white bread, the medieval equivalent of a flex. It was more expensive because it required extra milling, and because rich people will always find a way to pay more for things that should cost less. When times were tough, people got creative. Grain shortages meant bulking up bread with whatever was lying around: peas, beans, acorns, or if you were feeling particularly experimental, whatever you could scrape off the barn floor. The result? Horse bread. Not because it was for horses, but because it probably tasted like hooves. If you lived in a noble household, your bread served a second purpose. It was your plate. Called a trencher, this was a thick slab of bread that acted as a medieval dish. After soaking up whatever meat, juices, and grease were left from your meal, you could either eat it or, if you were feeling particularly generous, toss it to the poor. Nothing says charity like handing someone your used, gravy-soaked dinnerware. If you often romanticize medieval periods, you might be familiar with LA. People drank a lot of ale, and unfortunately, you're right there. They used to drink a lot of ale, like a gallon a day per person. Why? Because clean water was a rare luxury. Children, servants, monks, everyone was knocking back pints like they were living in a frat house. Ale came in different varieties. Small ale was the kiddie version, less alcohol, more hydration. Because when you're 5 years old and toiling in the fields, you need a little pick-me-up, right? Mead, on the other hand, was for those who wanted to feel fancy. Made from honey, it was basically the medieval equivalent of a cocktail. Some variations even had added raspberries or hazelnuts, because even in the Dark Ages, people knew that flavored alcohol made suffering slightly more bearable. Of course, water wasn't completely off the table. If you were lucky enough to have access to a clean river, stream, or well, you could drink like a responsible adult until someone upstream dumped their doo-doo in it. Then it was back to ale, because dysentery wasn't a vibe. Medieval people didn't say vegetables. They just called everything herbs, because why complicate things? Peasants relied heavily on these herbs, since actual meat was a luxury. The rich, however, considered vegetables peasant food except onions, leeks, and garlic, which somehow got a pass. Everything else? Unworthy. If you were noble and someone handed you a carrot, you might as well have been handed a tax notice. Some vegetables were straight up feared. Lentils were avoided because they were thought to cause internal inflammation, blindness, and nightmares. Cucumbers were seen as fever-inducing death sticks, which probably explains why medieval France had a reputation for being full of sickly people, not the lack of hygiene, of course. And if you thought raw salads were refreshing, think again. Raw food was considered a direct ticket to the afterlife. Cookbooks literally warned people to avoid them unless they wanted to make their master sick. So instead, everything got boiled, stewed, or drowned in honey, because what's the point of vitamins when you can just cook them out completely?
Now let's talk about soups. If you were poor, you ate pottage. If you were rich, you ate fancy pottage. Either way, you were eating some form of soup-stew hybrid that had been simmering over an open fire for hours, sometimes days. The average peasant's pottage was a sad affair, mostly water, a few scraps of vegetables, and if they were lucky, a tiny bit of meat. The rich, on the other hand, got thicker, meatier versions because even their soups had to flex on the poor. The best part, it never really stopped cooking. You just kept adding stuff to the pot, and it was a
never-ending cycle of mystery flavors. It's safe to assume that at some point, people were probably consuming week-old broth that had seen more seasons than some medieval kings. Now, what else would they have had at that time? Yup, fresh milk. Well, forget it. Refrigeration didn't exist, so milk went bad faster than your social standing if you offended a noble. Instead, people drank fermented buttermilk or whey from cheese-making. Yum. Cheese was the more reliable option, and workers often carried a hunk of it with some bread as their midday meal, which, to be fair, doesn't sound terrible, until you realize that medieval cheese was probably as hard as a rock and tasted like regret. And finally, let's talk about the one thing that truly separates medieval life from modern existence. The fact that most people spent their entire lives eating soup, stale bread, and drinking beer, while somehow still managing to be healthier than the average fast food addict today. So next time you take a big bite of that burger and chase it with a soda, just remember that some medieval peasant is probably rolling in his grave, grumbling that his food didn't come with a side of microplastics and a heart attack. Anyway, drop a comment on what you'd be munching on if you randomly spawned into the medieval ages. Moldy bread, fancy trenchers, and hey, hit that subscribe button. Who knows, maybe the next video will finally give you a good reason to romanticize this era.